The heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on the dusty square, baking the smell of livestock and nervous sweat into the air. Alara felt it on her skin, a sticky film that made her dress cling. But the heat inside her was different. It was a cold, hard thing, a stone of shame lodged beneath her ribs. Her father was speaking. His voice was pitched to carry, a merchant's voice, trying to sound reasonable, even magnanimous. "A fine girl," he said, his hand gesturing towards her without quite touching. "Strong, healthy, a good worker," the crowd murmured. A few men shifted their weight, their eyes sliding over her. They were not looking at a person. They were looking at a list of attributes. Wide-hipped, heavy-footed, plain. She had heard the words her whole life, whispered behind hands, spoken in jest by cousins, reflected in the disappointed set of her father's jaw. Now they were being broadcast in a public square as virtues of a sort. The virtues of a draft horse. The man beside her father, a broker named Henderson with a face like curdled milk, stepped forward. "Her father, a man of unfortunate but temporary circumstance, has agreed to place her indenture," Henderson announced, his voice slick. "To settle his accounts. A 5-year term. The price is agreed. All that is needed is the contractor's public acceptance. Indenture. A clean word for a dirty thing." She was not being sold. Not quite. She was being leased. Her father had lost everything. The shop, the house, the last of her mother's jewelry. And now this. The final asset to be liquidated. A man stepped out of the small crowd. He was not the man she had been told to expect. Not the poor cowboy with the honest face her father had described in a fit of manufactured sentimentality. "He needs a good wife," her father had said just last night, his eyes not meeting hers. "Not a rich one. A good woman to make a home." A lie. It had all been a lie. This man was Marcus Thorne. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His coat was fine wool, even in this heat. He was wealth. He was power. He was the man who held all the notes, the man to whom everyone in this parched county owed something. Thorne smiled, a flash of white teeth in a tanned, handsome face. He looked at Alara, and his eyes held the same casual appraisal as the others, but with an added glimmer of ownership. He was not assessing a horse. He was admiring a trophy he had already won. "I accept the terms," Thorne said, his voice smooth as river stone. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Not cruel, not yet. Just the sound of tension releasing. The sound of a good show. The shame in Alara's chest tightened, the cold stone threatening to crack. She had stood silent for so long. Silent through the whispers. Silent through the pitying looks. Silent through her father's desperate, pathetic lies. Something inside her broke. Not with a snap, but with a slow, grinding tear. She took a step forward. Her father's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "Alara, be still." She shook him off. The movement was clumsy, not graceful, but it was decisive. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne. "You accept the terms," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. The square went quiet. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I do," he said, recovering. "A bargain is a bargain." "And what is the bargain?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "For my labor? For my skills?" Henderson, the broker, sputtered. "The contract is clear. I can read a ledger," Alara said, her gaze unwavering from Thorne's face. "I can calculate yields and manage stock. I can mend machinery your blacksmith can't puzzle out. Are those the terms? Is that what you are buying for 5 years?" A deep, rumbling laugh came from someone in the back. Then another. The humiliation was no longer a cold stone. It was fire licking up her throat. Thorne's expression hardened. The charming veneer dissolved, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "I am buying your obedience," he said, his voice low and sharp. "As is my right. Your father has seen to it." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He addressed the crowd as if she were no longer there. "The debt is settled. My business here is done." He nodded to 2 of his men, who moved to stand on either side of Alara. She did not look at them. She looked at her father. He would not meet her eyes. He was looking at his shoes, a small man made smaller by his choices. The sound of the crowd's laughter was the last thing she heard as she was led away. It followed her, a wave of mockery that washed over her and left her empty. Cha! They did not take her far. Just to the alley behind the livery, a narrow space that smelled of hay and manure and hopelessness. Thorne's men were not rough, just efficient. "Wait here," one of them said. "The boss has other business. He'll send for you." Then they were gone, leaving her alone. She stood with her back pressed against the rough wood of the stable wall. The laughter still echoed in her ears. Obedience. That was the word he had used. Not work, not skill, not even companionship. Just the silent, pliant bending of her will to his. The fire of her anger collapsed into ash. The cold stone of shame was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching void. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Then another. She slid down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt, her sturdy dress bunched around her. The sobs came then, not loud or hysterical, but deep, wrenching tremors that shook her whole frame. It was not just the shame of the day. It was the shame of a lifetime. Every time she had been made to feel too large, too slow, too much. Every time she had been overlooked in favor of her prettier, daintier cousins. Every time her sharp mind had been dismissed as an unwomanly curiosity. It all came pouring out in the filth of the alley. She cried for the girl she had been, the one who believed her father's praise. She cried for the woman she was, sold to settle a debt. When the tears finally subsided, a strange calm settled over her. The emptiness remained, but it was no longer an ache. It was a space. A clean, cold, empty space. She looked at her hands, resting on her knees. They were capable hands. Not delicate, not beautiful, but they knew how to work. They knew how to fix things. She made a vow, there in the shadows. A quiet promise to the empty space inside her. She would survive. She would serve the 5 years. She would be obedient, as the man demanded. But she would never, ever trust again. She would never depend on anyone. Not on a father's love. Not on a husband's kindness. And certainly not on the mercy of a man like Marcus Thorne. Her heart was a fortress now. The drawbridge was up. The gates were sealed. There would be no more entry. She would rely on herself. Only on herself. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a muddy streak. She got to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress. She would wait. And she would be ready. WG. An hour passed. Maybe 2. The sun began to dip, painting the sliver of sky she could see in shades of orange and purple. The sounds of the town quieted. Footsteps approached down the alley. Heavy, steady, unhurried. Not the crisp, arrogant stride of Marcus Thorne. She tensed, her back flat against the wall. A man appeared at the mouth of the alley. He was tall and broad, his form a silhouette against the fading light. He stopped, his hat shadowing his face. "Miss Alara?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. She did not answer. Distrust was a shield. He took a slow step forward, into the gloom. She could see him better now. He was not one of Thorne's men. His clothes were worn, practical. A dusty denim jacket, patched at the elbow. Jeans faded nearly white at the knees. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long distances and hard squinting. He looked at her, and his gaze was not like the others. It was not appraising. It was not dismissive. It was assessing. The way a man looks at a fence that needs mending. Not with judgment, but with a quiet calculation of what was broken and what it would take to fix it. "My name is Silas," he said. "I've come to take you to Stone Creek Ranch." Stone Creek. That was not Thorne's property. Thorne's holdings were in the lush valley to the east. Stone Creek was high in the dry hills, a place of rock and scrub, known for its stubbornness and its poverty. "I belong to Marcus Thorne," she said, the words tasting like poison. The man, Silas, shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am," he said. "You don't." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Thorne bought your father's debt. I bought the debt from Thorne." He held the paper out to her. She stared at it, unmoving. "Why?" she asked, the word sharp with suspicion. "Thorne was owed a favor," Silas said, his gaze steady. "And I don't like his way of doing business." He said it simply, a statement of fact. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. A poor cowboy, needs a good wife. Was this him? The man from the lie? It didn't matter. A new owner was still an owner. So now I belong to you, she said, her voice flat. A flicker of something, annoyance, regret, crossed his face. No, he said again, more firmly this time. That paper is an indenture contract. It gives me a claim on your labor for 5 years. It does not give me a claim on you. She almost laughed. It was a bitter, ugly sound. A fine distinction. It's the only distinction that matters, he said. He took another step closer, holding the paper out again. I run a ranch. It's hard work. I need help. That's all. She finally took the paper. Her name was there, written in her father's looping script. And below it, the scrawled, arrogant signature of Marcus Thorne, crossed out. And beneath that, a new signature. Silas Blackwood. You can have the room over the kitchen, he said, as if she had already agreed to come. It has a lock on the inside. The key is yours. You'll be paid a wage, same as my other hand, Jet. You're free to leave whenever you want. The contract just means you'd be breaking it, and I'd have a claim on the wages I'd paid you. She looked up from the paper, her eyes narrowing. A room with a lock. Wages. The freedom to leave. These were not the terms of indenture. This was a trap. A more subtle one than Thorne's, but a trap nonetheless. Why? She asked again. Why go to this trouble for a stranger? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face. I was there today, he said finally. In the square. I saw what happened. He did not say he felt sorry for her. He did not offer pity. He just stated a fact. No one should be treated like that, he added. The simple declaration hit her harder than any expression of sympathy could have. Still, the walls of her fortress held. I don't need your charity, she said, her voice hard. Good, he replied, without missing a beat. I'm not offering it. I'm offering a job. The work is real. The pay is real. The choice is real. He gestured with his head back toward the street. My wagon's at the end of the alley. It's a long ride to Stone Creek. We should get started before it's full dark. He turned and began to walk away, not waiting for her answer. He was leaving the choice to her. Truly leaving it. She could stay in this alley. She could go back to her father's empty house. She could try to make her way in a town that had laughed at her humiliation. Or she could follow this strange, quiet man to a place she did not know. She looked down at the contract in her hand. A claim on her labor. Not on her. It was a razor's edge of a distinction, but it was the only one she had. She took a deep breath, the alley air thick in her lungs. And she followed him. When they reached the wagon, a simple, sturdy buckboard, he stopped and turned to her. He looked at her face, at the streak of mud on her cheek, at the exhaustion in her eyes. He seemed to see everything. Are you hungry? He asked. The question was so simple. So direct. So human. No one had asked her that all day. The knot of suspicion in her gut loosened, just a fraction. She gave a small, jerky nod. He reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. He handed it to her. There's bread and cheese. And an apple. He then turned his back to her, busying himself with checking the harness on one of the horses. He was giving her privacy. The space to eat without being watched. Without being judged. It was a small kindness. A non-transactional kindness. And it was the first crack in the walls she had just built so carefully around her heart. She unwrapped the bundle. The bread was coarse but fresh. The cheese was sharp. She took a bite, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. Chug. The journey to Stone Creek Ranch was made mostly in silence. The rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels were the only sounds for long stretches. Alara sat on the hard bench, the indenture paper tucked into her dress pocket. The world outside the wagon was a wash of gray and black under a sky littered with stars. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Silas drove with a relaxed, competent focus, his hands light on the reins. He did not try to make conversation. He did not ask about her past. He seemed content with the silence. It was a comfortable quiet, not an awkward one. For the first time in a very long time, Alara did not feel the need to fill the space with words or to shrink herself to take up less of it. She simply sat and watched the dark shapes of the hills roll by. They arrived well after midnight. The ranch was a collection of dark, angular buildings huddled under a stand of ancient oaks. A dog barked once, then fell silent. A light glowed in the window of the main house. "That'll be Jed," Silas said, his first words in over an hour. "He worries." He pulled the wagon to a halt in the dusty yard. An old man emerged from the house, a lantern held high. He was thin and wiry, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. This must be Jed, the other hand. He held the lantern up, its light falling on Alara. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, took her in from head to toe. There was no surprise in his expression. No judgment. Just a quiet, thorough assessment. "Supper's on the stove," he said to Silas, his voice a dry rasp. "Kept it warm." "This is Alara," Silas said. "She'll be helping us." Jed nodded once at her. A short, sharp dip of his chin. "Room's ready," he said. And that was all. No questions. No whispers. Just acceptance. Silas led her into the house. The main room was large and sparsely furnished. A long wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace. It was clean, but it had the distinct feel of a place run by men. Functional. Lacking any touch of softness. But what struck Alara most was the state of things. A stack of papers on the table was held down by a rock. A saddle, its leather cracked and in need of oiling, was slung over a chair back. The whole place felt precarious, like it was holding on by a thread. "The kitchen is through there," Silas said, pointing. "Your room is upstairs. First door on the right." He handed her a heavy iron key. "The lock is new," he said. "Jed put it on this afternoon." He had been so certain she would come. Or perhaps he had simply been prepared for either outcome. She went up the narrow, creaking stairs. The room was small and plain, with a sloped ceiling and a single window. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt. A small wooden chest for her things. It was more than she had expected. It was a space of her own. She walked to the door and looked at the new lock. It was heavy, solid brass. She turned the key. The bolt slid home with a satisfying, definitive click. Safety. She had not realized how much she craved it until she felt it. She slept that night more deeply than she had in years. She woke with the first light of dawn, the room cool and quiet. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the day before came flooding back. The square. Thorn. The alley. Silas. She got out of bed and went to the window. Below, the ranch was coming to life. Silas and Jed were already in the corral, working with a pair of young horses. Their movements were economical, practiced. They communicated with nods and gestures, a language of shared work. Alara watched them for a long time. Then she turned and went downstairs. The kitchen was as she had suspected. Dishes were clean but stacked haphazardly. Pots and pans hung from hooks, but in no discernible order. The pantry was a jumble of sacks and tins. It was functional chaos. She did not ask for permission. She did not announce her intentions. She simply began to work. She found an apron hanging on a peg and tied it around her waist. She stoked the fire in the wood stove and put a large pot of water on to boil. Then she started on the pantry. She took everything out. She wiped down the shelves. She sorted the sacks of flour, cornmeal, and beans. She arranged the tins by content, creating neat, logical rows. It was calming work. The imposition of order on chaos. It was a language she understood. By the time the sun was fully up, she had the pantry organized. She had started a pot of coffee. And she had a batch of biscuits rising on the back of the stove. The smell of coffee and baking bread filled the small house. Silas and Jed came in, stamping the dust from their boots. They stopped in the doorway, their faces showing a kind of quiet astonishment. They looked at the neat pantry. They looked at the organized kitchen. They looked at the biscuits browning in the oven. Silas looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a hint of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. "Huh," Jed said. It was a single syllable. But in it, Alara heard a world of impressed surprise. They ate breakfast at the long table. The biscuits were light and fluffy. The coffee was strong. No one spoke of the changes in the kitchen. They just ate, the silence punctuated by the scrape of forks on plates. When they were done, Silas pushed his chair back. "Supper was good," he said. She realized he meant the bread and cheese from the night before. Breakfast was better, he added, his eyes meeting hers across the table. It was, she understood, the highest form of praise he was capable of giving. A statement of fact, delivered without adornment. It settled in her chest, a small, warm weight. Not shame. Something else entirely. WG. The days settled into a rhythm. Alara ran the house with a quiet efficiency that left the two men slightly bewildered and deeply grateful. Meals appeared on time. Clothes were mended before they were even aware they were torn. The chaos of the house slowly receded, replaced by a calm, functional order. She never asked for thanks. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. She worked. It was what she knew. But she also watched. She watched the ranch. She saw the fences that were patched with wire and hope. She saw the cattle, thin from grazing on sparse land. She saw the worry in Silas's eyes when he thought no one was looking. Stone Creek Ranch was dying. A slow, lingering death. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, the crisis came. A shout from the yard brought her to the door. Silas and Jed were standing by the well, staring down at the pump. "It's the gear," Jed was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Stripped again. Won't draw a drop." "That's the third time this season," Silas said, his jaw tight. "We don't have the water, we lose the stock." The pump was the heart of the ranch. It drew water from the deep well into the troughs for the cattle and the cistern for the house. Without it, they would have to haul water by the barrel from the creek a mile away. An impossible task. "I'll have to ride to town," Silas said. "See if the blacksmith can forge a new one. It'll take days. And cost money we don't have." Alara stepped out onto the porch. She had been listening. "It's not the gear," she said, her voice quiet. Both men turned to look at her. Silas's expression was one of confusion. Jed's was one of sharp curiosity. "Ma'am," Silas asked. "The gear is stripping because the draw rod is misaligned," she said, walking towards them. "It's putting uneven pressure on the teeth. You can replace the gear 100 times. It will just keep stripping until you fix the root of the problem." She pointed to the long iron rod that disappeared into the well housing. "See how it shudders just before it engages? It's off by maybe 1/4 of an inch at the top bearing. It's causing a torque." She had learned about mechanics from the traveling tinkers her father used to hire. She had a mind for systems, for cause and effect. She saw the world as a series of interlocking parts. Silas and Jed stared at the pump, then back at her. They had been fighting the symptom. She had seen the disease. How do you know that?" Silas asked, his voice filled with genuine astonishment. "I listen," she said simply. "It's been making a clicking sound for days, just before the grinding starts." Jed knelt, peering into the pump's housing, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He grunted. "She's right," he said, looking up at Silas. "Look here, the wear on the casing." Silas knelt beside him. He was silent for a long time. Then he stood up and looked at Alara. He looked at her not as a cook, not as a housekeeper, not as a woman. He looked at her as an equal, as someone with a mind that worked in ways his did not. It was the first time in her life anyone had ever looked at her that way. The feeling was dizzying. "Can you fix it?" he asked. It was not a command. It was a question. A plea. "I think so," she said. "We'll need to pull the rod. Shim the bearing with a piece of tin or brass until it's seated properly. Then we'll have to file the teeth on the existing gear to get it to catch, just until we can afford a new 1-inch. She laid out the plan with the same methodical calm she used to organize the pantry. For the rest of the afternoon, the three of them worked. Alara directed. Silas and Jed provided the muscle. They worked together, a well-oiled machine. By dusk, the pump was working. The draw rod moved with a smooth, clean motion. The water that gushed into the trough was clear and cold and beautiful. Jed dipped a cup in and drank, then handed it to Silas. Silas drank, then looked at Alara. He did not smile. His face was serious, his eyes dark with a dawning realization. He had brought a housekeeper to his ranch. He was beginning to understand that he had gotten something else entirely. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What else can you do?" he asked. The question hung in the evening air, vast and full of possibility. It was the key to a door she had thought was permanently locked. The door to being seen for who she was. Not what she looked like. Cha. A few nights later, after a silent supper, Silas did not get up from the table. Jed, with the uncanny perception of the old, quietly excused himself and went out to the porch to smoke his pipe. Silas gestured to the stack of papers held down by the rock. "I need you to look at these," he said. It was not a request. It was a surrender. He was admitting he was lost, and she was his only guide. Alara moved the rock and pulled the stack towards her. They were ledgers. Ranch accounts, cattle sale receipts, notes from the bank, letters from suppliers. A history of Stone Creek's slow decline. "We're losing money," Silas said, his voice flat. "Every year, we fall a little further behind. The cattle prices are down. The feed costs are up. The land is dry. I've sold off the north pasture. I've taken loans against the rest. I don't know what else to do." He sounded tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. It was the weariness of a man fighting a battle on too many fronts. Alara said nothing. She opened the first ledger. Her father, for all his failings, had taught her numbers. She could read a balance sheet the way some women could read a prayer book. For hours, she worked. The only sounds were the scratching of her pencil on a spare sheet of paper and the sigh of the wind outside. Silas sat across from her, watching. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He just waited. Alara laid the pages out, creating columns, cross-referencing dates and figures. A pattern began to emerge. It was subtle. A series of small, unrelated misfortunes that, when taken together, painted a dark picture. A shipment of winter feed that was recorded as delivered but was 20% short on weight. The supplier was a new one, recommended by the bank. A bill of sale for 20 head of cattle where the price per head was mysteriously 10% below market rate. The buyer was an agent acting for an unnamed party. A series of small, recurring charges for water access rights to a section of the creek that had always been part of the Stone Creek deed. The charges had started 3 years ago. Each one was a small cut, a nick, a scratch. But together, they were bleeding the ranch dry. This was not bad luck. This was a plan. A deliberate, patient, methodical campaign of sabotage. "Where is the map of the original property?" she asked, her voice low. Silas retrieved a rolled-up, yellow document from a chest in the corner. She spread it out on the table. The original deed for Stone Creek Ranch, granted to Silas's grandfather. She traced the property lines with her finger. Her eyes scanned the legal descriptions, the water rights, the easements. And then she found it. A name. A witness signature on a recent survey document that redefined the creek's boundary. A signature on the feed supply contract. A signature as the bank's representative on the loan documents. Marcus Thorne. The name was a punch to the gut. It all came together. The public humiliation. The indenture. Thorne hadn't just wanted to own her. He had been trying to acquire the ranch all along. He had been strangling it, waiting for Silas to default so he could pick it up for pennies on the dollar from the bank he controlled. Buying her indenture was just another way to tighten the screws, to put a man he saw as his social inferior in his place. "It's him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Thorne." She explained what she had found. She laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The shorted feed. The undervalued cattle sales. The fraudulent water fees. As she spoke, she watched the understanding dawn on Silas's face. And then the rage. It was a cold, hard fury that tightened his jaw and turned his eyes to chips of granite. He had trusted these people. The supplier. The bank. He had believed he was failing because of his own shortcomings. The knowledge that he had been cheated, systematically and with cold intent, was a profound betrayal. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "I'll kill him," he said, his voice a low growl. He meant it. Just then, the sound of an approaching carriage echoed in the yard. A fine, polished carriage, pulled by a pair of perfectly matched black horses. It was a vehicle of wealth and arrogance. A moment later, a knock came at the door. Not a polite rap. A confident, commanding summons. Silas moved towards the door, his fists clenched. Alara put a hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. "Don't let him see what you know." He looked at her, his anger warring with her caution. She held his gaze. He gave a short, sharp nod, and went to the door. Marcus Thorne stood on the porch, bathed in the moonlight. He was smiling. "Blackwood," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "A lovely evening. I was just passing by on my way from the county seat. Thought I'd check on my investment." His eyes slid past Silas and landed on Alara, standing in the middle of the room. His smile widened. He had not expected her to be here. He had expected her to be hidden away, a source of shame. Instead, she was at the center of the house, with the ranch's secrets spread out on the table before her. She was a variable he had not accounted for. Well, Thorne said, stepping into the house without an invitation. "Look at this. Domestic bliss." He strolled over to the table, his gaze sweeping over the papers. He looked at Alara, his eyes glinting with amusement and malice. "I see you've put her to work," he said to Silas, as if she weren't there. "Good. It's important to get value for one's money." He then turned his full attention to her. "I must say, I'm surprised to see you here, Alara. I was under the impression Blackwood had more refined tastes." He was trying to undermine her, to remind her of her shame, to reestablish the power dynamic of the town square. But something had changed. She was not the same woman who had stood in that dusty alley. She had a lock on her door. She had fixed a pump. She had uncovered a conspiracy. She looked at the handsome, polished man before her, and she felt no fear. Only a cold, clear certainty. He had underestimated her. It was going to be his undoing. WG. After Thorne left, a cloud of smug satisfaction trailing behind him, Silas's rage returned, hotter than before. "I should have broken him in half," he snarled, pacing the length of the room. "And then what?" Alara asked, her voice calm and steady. "He would have you arrested for assault. He owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He would take the ranch, and you would rot in a cell. Is that the victory you want?" Her logic was a bucket of cold water on his anger. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his chest heaving. "He can't be allowed to get away with this," he said, the words torn from his throat. "He won't," she said, "but we can't fight him with fists. He is stronger than you in that arena. He has money and influence. We have to fight him with this." She tapped the ledger with her finger. "The truth. What good is the truth when he owns the people who are supposed to uphold it?" Silas asked, the bitterness evident in his voice. "The truth is a weapon," she said, "but it must be sharpened. We need more proof. We need copies of the original deeds from the county records office. We need signed statements from the other ranchers he's cheated. We need to build a case so undeniable that even a corrupt judge can't ignore it without exposing himself." She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a strategist, a general planning a campaign. Silas stared at her, a new kind of awe in his eyes. "We?" he asked, his voice soft. She met his gaze. "Yes," she said. "We." The word hung in the air between them. It was a declaration, an oath of allegiance. She was no longer just a resident of Stone Creek Ranch. She was its defender. This was her fight now, too. Silas saw the shift. He felt it. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. He was no longer fighting for just land and cattle. He was fighting for her, too. "All right," he said. "What do we do first?" They began to work in secret. During the day, they were a rancher, a foreman, and a housekeeper. At night, they were a small band of conspirators. Alara drew up lists. Silas rode out, visiting other ranchers in the high country, speaking to them in low tones, gathering stories of Thorne's treachery. Jed used his long-standing connections in the town to find out which clerks at the county office were honest. Thorne, sensing a change, began to escalate. He could no longer bleed the ranch slowly. He needed it to hemorrhage. Rumors began to circulate in town. Whispers about the fat girl Silas Blackwood had bought and was keeping at his ranch. Gossip that painted Alara as a woman of loose morals and Silas as a fool who had been bewitched by her. Alara heard the rumors when she went to town for supplies. The averted eyes. The snickers behind cupped hands. It was the town square all over again, but this time it was worse. They were not just attacking her appearance. They were attacking her character. And through her, they were attacking Silas. Then came the direct sabotage. A section of fence was cut, and a dozen head of cattle wandered off into the canyons. It took them 2 days to find them. A small fire broke out in the hay barn, started by a stray spark. Jed smelled lamp oil and put it out before it could take hold. Each incident was a new blow, designed to wear them down, to break their spirit. The pressure began to take its toll on Alara. The fortress of her heart, so recently breached by kindness and respect, began to crumble under the assault of public opinion. The old voices of shame returned. Too large. Too much. A burden. One afternoon, in the general store, she overheard two women talking. "It's a shame about Silas Blackwood," one said. "He was always such a proud man. To be brought so low by that woman. They say Thorn will have his ranch by winter," the other replied. "Serves him right, I suppose. A man makes his bed." The words were like daggers. They confirmed her deepest fear. She was the cause of all this. If she had never come to Stone Creek, Thorn would not have accelerated his attacks. Silas might have lost the ranch eventually, but he would have lost it with his dignity intact. She was the weakness Thorn was exploiting. She was a liability. A poison. That night, she made a decision. She packed her few belongings into a small bundle. She wrote a short note, leaving it on the kitchen table. "Thank you for your kindness. I can't let you lose everything because of me." She would leave before dawn. She would disappear. It was the only way to save him. As she sat on her bed in the dark, waiting for the right time to slip away, a frantic shout came from the yard. "Fire! The barn! The main barn is on fire!" It was Jed's voice, cracked with panic. Alara ran to the window. The largest barn, the one that held all their winter hay and the most valuable equipment, was engulfed in flames. Orange light flickered against the dark sky, a monstrous, hungry thing. This was not a small fire. This was an inferno. This was Thorn's final move. She forgot about her plan to leave. She forgot about everything except the roar of the fire and the sudden, gut-wrenching fear for the two men who had shown her kindness. She ran downstairs and burst out into the yard. The heat was intense, a solid wall that pushed her back. Silas was running towards the barn, a bucket in his hand. "It's too late for the hay," Jed yelled. "We have to get the horses out." The horses, trapped in their stalls at the far end of the barn, were screaming in terror. Just as Silas reached the barn door, a section of the roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks and burning timbers down. He recoiled, his face grim. And then they heard it. A human cry from inside. "Help me. I'm trapped." It was one of the young hands, a boy named Billy who had been hired on for the summer. He must have been sleeping in the loft. Silas didn't hesitate. He soaked a horse blanket in the water trough and threw it over his head. "Stay back," he yelled at Alara and Jed. And then he ran into the burning building. Alara stood frozen, watching the doorway through which he had disappeared. The world narrowed to that rectangle of fire. Her note was still on the kitchen table. Her bundle was still on her bed. She had been about to run away to save him. How could she have been so wrong? Her presence here was not his weakness. It was his strength. The fight was his strength. She had given him a reason to fight, a way to fight. And she had been about to take that away. A moment later, Silas emerged from the smoke, half carrying, half dragging the coughing, terrified boy. He got him cleared just as the main beam of the barn gave way with a deafening crack, and the entire structure imploded into a roaring pyre. Silas laid the boy on the ground, away from the heat. He was burned and smoke-blackened, but he was alive. He stood up and turned, his eyes finding Alara in the flickering light. He saw the bundle in her hand, the one she had grabbed without thinking as she ran out of the house. He saw the truth in her eyes. He walked over to her, his face a mask of soot and fury and something else. Something that looked like heartbreak. "You were leaving?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard them in town," she whispered, her voice choked with smoke and unshed tears. "They said I was ruining you. I thought if I was gone." "You thought wrong," he said, his voice low and fierce. He reached out and took her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "Do you have any idea what you are? You are the smartest, most capable person I have ever met. You saw what I couldn't see. You gave me hope when I had none. Ruining me? Alara, you are the only thing holding this place together. You are the only reason I'm still standing." He was breathing hard, the words pouring out of him. "I have been defending you," he said, his voice dropping. "In town, To anyone who would listen. I told them what you did for the pump. I told them you were a partner, not a servant. I told them they were fools for judging a book by its cover. He let go of her arm and gestured to the burning barn. This is not your fault. This is his. And he will not win. We will not let him win. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. Don't run, he said. Stay. Fight with me. In the light of the fire that was meant to destroy them, she saw the truth. Her worth was not determined by the whispers of the townspeople. It was forged here, in the dust and the struggle of this ranch. It was reflected in the eyes of this man who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time in her life. She let the bundle fall from her hand. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Chug. The fire was the final blow. The barn, the hay, the equipment, all gone. The insurance, they soon learned, had been canceled 2 weeks prior. A notice had apparently been sent, but it had never arrived. Another of Thorne's machinations. Silas was financially ruined. The bank, with Thorne pulling the strings, called in his loans. A foreclosure hearing was set. It was to be held in the town hall in 2 weeks. It was a formality. A public execution. Thorne had won. Or so he thought. The night after the fire, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and defeat. Silas stared into his empty coffee cup. It's over, he said. Jed, his face grim, nodded slowly. Nothing left to sell. Nothing left to fight with. Alara looked at the two men. She saw their despair. She saw their exhaustion. But she also saw the firelight reflected in their eyes. The fire that had taken so much had also burned away the last of their illusions. No, she said, her voice cutting through the gloom. It's not over. It's just beginning. She stood up and went to the small chest where she kept her things. She pulled out a packet of papers, wrapped in oilcloth. For the past 2 weeks, she said, laying the packet on the table, I have been writing letters. To every homesteader, every rancher, every merchant within 100 miles who has ever had dealings with Marcus Thorne. She unwrapped the packet. Inside were sworn affidavits. 12 of them. Each one telling a story of Thorne's predatory practices. Short-weighted grain. Unfair loan terms. Land boundaries mysteriously redrawn. And I went to the county records office, she continued, producing another document. The clerk Jed told us about. The one who hates Thorne. He gave me this. It was a certified copy of the original water rights survey for the entire district. A document Thorne thought had been lost in a courthouse fire 10 years ago. It proved that his claims to the creek access were fraudulent. Not just for Stone Creek. For half the ranches in the high country. The foreclosure hearing isn't just about this ranch anymore, she said, her eyes burning with a cold fire of their own. It's a public forum. The whole town will be there. The same people who laughed at me in the square. The same people who whispered about us in the store. She looked at Silas. Thorne expects you to come begging for mercy. He expects you to be broken. He will not be expecting a fight. And he certainly will not be expecting me. A spark of hope ignited in Silas's eyes. What are you planning? He asked. He thinks the hearing is his stage, she said. We're going to make it ours. F2. The day of the hearing, the town hall was packed. It was the biggest event of the season. Better than a hanging. The entire cast of Alara's humiliation and vindication was present. The whispering women from the general store. The men who had laughed in the square. Her father, sitting in the back, his face a mask of shame and regret. And Marcus Thorne, sitting at the front table with his lawyer, looking confident, magnanimous. He was dressed in his finest suit, the picture of civic virtue and financial power. Silas, Jed, and Alara sat at the opposing table. They were not dressed in their finest. They were dressed in their work clothes, stained with the smoke of the fire. They looked like what they were, defeated. The hearing began. The bank's lawyer, a slick man from the city, laid out the case. It was simple. Silas Blackwood had defaulted on his loans. The bank was exercising its right to foreclose. The judge, a man whose campaign had been generously funded by Thorne, listened with a somber, impartial expression. It was all a carefully choreographed play. When the lawyer was finished, the judge turned to Silas. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice oozing false sympathy. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Silas stood up. He looked at Thorne. He looked at the judge. He looked at the faces of the townspeople. "I do not," he said, his voice clear and strong. A murmur went through the crowd. He was giving up without a fight. Thorne allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. "However," Silas continued, "my partner has a statement she would like to make." He sat down and looked at Alara. Every eye in the room turned to her. She stood up, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was just a large, plain woman in a worn dress. What could she possibly have to say? Thorne's lawyer rose. "Objection. This woman has no legal standing here. She is an employee, a domestic. She is my partner," Silas said, his voice ringing with authority. "Her name is on the deed as of this morning. I filed it myself." The room erupted in whispers. Thorne's face went rigid. This was not part of the script. The judge, flustered, looked at Thorne, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well," the judge said, his voice tight. "The court will hear from Miss Alara." Alara did not look at the judge. She did not look at Thorne. She looked at the people of the town. "You all know me," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. "You saw me in the square. You saw my father sell my future to settle a debt. Most of you laughed. A wave of unease rippled through the crowd. You have whispered about me in the streets. You have called me a whore and a homewrecker. You have judged me for my size, for my face, for the fact that a good man showed me kindness." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, you are here to watch that same good man lose his home. You believe it is because he is a poor rancher. You believe it is because of bad luck. You are wrong." She turned her gaze to Marcus Thorne. "You are here to witness the final act of a crime. A crime committed not with a gun, but with a ledger book. A crime of greed, perpetrated by the richest man in this county against his neighbors." She laid the first document on the table. The certified copy of the Water Rights Survey. "This is the original survey of this district. It shows that the water rights Mr. Thorne has been charging for years, are not his to sell. They are public rights. He has been stealing from every rancher on this mountain." She then laid out the affidavits. "These are statements from 12 of your neighbors. They detail how Mr. Thorne's bank has trapped them in debt, how his suppliers have cheated them, how he has slowly, patiently strangled them." She walked through the evidence, piece by piece, her voice clear and logical. She was not emotional. She was not angry. She was a force of nature, a torrent of irrefutable fact. The crowd was mesmerized. They were no longer watching a foreclosure. They were watching an indictment. Thorne's lawyer kept objecting, but his protests grew weaker and weaker. The judge's face grew pale. The play was falling apart. Finally, Alara came to the fire. "And when we discovered this," she said, her voice dropping, "when we began to fight back, Mr. Thorne decided to end it. He burned our barn. He nearly killed a boy. He destroyed a man's livelihood to cover his tracks." "Lies," Thorne shouted, leaping to his feet. "Slander. There is no proof." "Isn't there?" Alara asked calmly. "The night of the fire, you were seen by 2 witnesses on the road leading away from Stone Creek, a half-hour after it started. You were in a hurry. 2 old prospectors, men Thorne would have considered less than dirt, stood up in the back of the room." "That's right," one of them called out. "Saw his fancy carriage going like the devil was after him." Thorne's composure finally shattered. He stared at Alara, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He had been beaten, and not by a man, not by a peer, but by her. The fat girl, the piece of property, the domestic. The humiliation was too much for him. "You," he hissed, his voice venomous, shaking with rage. "You think you've won? You are nothing. A big, stupid cow who got lucky. You belong in a barn, not a courtroom." A collective gasp went through the room. It was his fatal mistake. In that one, vitriolic outburst, he had confirmed everything she had said about him. He had revealed the ugly, arrogant soul beneath the polished exterior. He had shown the townspeople who he truly was. Alara did not flinch. She just looked at him, a flicker of pity in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft. "You've just made my case for me." The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from the back, a single person began to clap. Then another. And another. Soon, the entire room was filled with the sound of applause. It was a storm of vindication, washing over her, cleansing the last traces of shame from her soul. The judge, seeing the tide had turned, began banging his gavel, calling for order. But no one was listening to him anymore. They were listening to the truth. G1. The aftermath was swift. The county sheriff, a man who valued his job more than Thorne's patronage, had no choice but to act. Faced with a room full of angry witnesses and a pile of damning evidence, he arrested Marcus Thorne on charges of fraud, arson, and attempted murder. The foreclosure case against Silas was dismissed. As Thorne was led away in handcuffs, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and fury, the townspeople swarmed Alara and Silas. They were no longer whispering. They were shouting their support. They were patting Silas on the back. They were offering Alara words of praise, of awe. She stood in the center of the storm, momentarily overwhelmed. This was the same crowd. The same people. Their judgment was a fickle, shallow thing. But their approval, however late, was still sweet. Silas stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence. He put a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of support that did not seek to claim her victory, only to witness it. He caught her eye over the heads of the crowd. He didn't smile. He just looked at her with an expression of profound, quiet pride. It was more than enough. G2. They rode back to Stone Creek in silence, the setting sun at their backs. The charred skeleton of the barn stood against the twilight sky, a monument to the battle they had won. There was so much to rebuild. But for the first time, it felt possible. They did their evening chores, the familiar rhythm a comfort after the chaos of the day. After a simple supper, they sat on the porch, as they often did. Jed was there, whittling a piece of wood, a rare, small smile on his face. The air was cool and smelled of pine. "The town will help us rebuild the barn," Silas said, breaking the long silence. "The other ranchers, too. They're calling it the Thorne tax. Everyone he cheated is chipping in." "Good," Alara said. They sat for another long while. Jed finished his whittling, grunted a good night, and disappeared into the house. They were alone. "I filed the deed this morning," Silas said, looking out at the dark hills. "You own half of Stone Creek. Free and clear." He turned to look at her. "It's not a gift," he said, his voice serious. "You earned it. You saved it. It's yours." She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. Her capable hands. She thought of the vow she had made in the alley. To never trust. To never depend. To rely only on herself. She had done that. She had relied on her mind, on her courage. And it had brought her here. To a place of safety. To a place of respect. "I know it's not what you ever planned for," Silas continued, his voice softer now. "And I know you've seen the worst of men. I'm not asking you for anything. Not for marriage. Not for a promise. The land is yours, whether you stay a day or a lifetime. You are free." He was giving her the one thing she had never had. A choice. A real choice, with no strings attached. She could take her half of the ranch's value and leave. She could go anywhere, be anyone. She was no longer the girl in the square. She was a woman of property. A woman of substance. A woman of worth. She looked out at the land stretching before them in the moonlight. The stubborn, rocky, beautiful land. It felt like hers. She looked at the man beside her. The quiet, principled, steady man who had looked at her and seen not a burden, but a partner. He felt like hers, too. Not as a possession, but as a choice. "I'm not a good man, Alara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "I'm just a man, trying to do right." "You're a good man, Silas," she said, her voice firm. She had been told she needed a good man, not a rich one. The irony was, she had found both. The ranch, with the cloud of Thorne's debt lifted, with the support of the community, would be prosperous. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the man. "I'm not staying because of the land," she said, finally looking at him. "And I'm not staying because I owe you anything." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I am staying because I want to." The three simple words were a vow more powerful than any she had ever made. A vow not of distrust, but of hope. A vow not of self-reliance, but of partnership. A smile, a real one, finally broke across Silas's weathered face. It transformed him, chasing away the last of the shadows. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to simply lay his beside hers on the wooden arm of the bench. His rough, calloused fingers brushed against hers. A small, quiet touch. A promise. A beginning. Together, they sat in the comfortable silence, looking out at the land they had saved. Their land. Their home.